Well, this is Dateline News and Conversation. We've kind of taken a pause, as many of you have noticed. Um, we were heavily attacked by drones here in Yalta 2 weeks ago. And on top of there being a serious fuel shortage, uh, we've been out of power for 2 or 3 days after those attacks. They knocked out power stations up and down the coast of Crimea from Sevastopol all the way up to Kerch. Sevastopol and Kerch have been hit many times, in fact, every day. This was the first time Yalta was hit. So the power has come back on, but it's unpredictable. Uh, just today, I lost power 3 times in the last hour trying to do this show. One was instantaneous, 1 second. Another was like maybe 5 minutes, and another was 10 minutes. Keep our fingers crossed that we can get this done tonight. The topic tonight is going to be the abolition of nukes. And a special request is being attempted to send to the American Pope Leo, asking him to convene a special peace convention, obviously dealing with the threat of nuclear war. My guest tonight, he doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm going to make one just to remind you and to add a couple of things to his background. It's Peter Kuznick. He's a professor of history, and he's the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. And Peter has been active in the civil rights movement, in the anti-Vietnam war movements, and he remains an active anti-war and nuclear abolition efforts. And it was in 1995 that he founded American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. He's an expert in this area. In fact, every summer since 1995, Peter has taken institute students on a study abroad class to Japan in the cities of Kyoto, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. You'll recall that Peter co-authored a 10-part Netflix documentary series and a book, both titled The Untold History of the United States. I want to welcome back to the show my good friend, Peter Kuznick. Peter, welcome back.
Hi, Regis. It's always good to be back with you.
Well, I appreciate your flexibility and your willingness to accommodate me, given the fact that, Jesus, we never know how long the power is going to be on. But what I'd like for you to do, and you can do it at your own pace, you recently returned from, I think, 10 days in Japan. I want you to let the audience know what you were doing there this time. And I know that later in the week, you'll be headed to Italy, I think, for a conference. And I'd like you to talk about that. But first of all, you're going to be on a show tonight for Consortium News. It's going to be live at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're going to be on with Rick Wolf and our good friend Ray McGovern. And you're going to be answering this question: how close are we to nuclear war? Now, you're well aware of my 2017 film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, in which you appear. At the time, I thought it was 30 seconds. And now, if I were to publish that film today, it would be like the final countdown, and we'd be at like 5, 4, and holding. So, Peter, first of all, how close are we, do you think, to nuclear war? And then, second of all, did that have anything to do with your trip to Japan this summer? Peter.
Regis, as you know better than anybody, we are dangerously close to nuclear war. It's not a certainty. It might not even be a likelihood, but just the fact that the possibility exists and is real and is growing is much more dangerous than our species can tolerate. Because nuclear war would very likely mean, if not the end of all life on this planet, the end of all large life on this planet. And there is no goal conceivable for which risking the future of humanity becomes a viable option. So just the fact that this is being contemplated and that we're on a trajectory that could lead to this is beyond something that I can in any way tolerate or contemplate. And my friend Robert J. Lifton, who was a Harvard and Yale psychiatrist who wrote about the psychiatry, the psychology of nuclear avoidance, really, coined the term nuclear numbing. And Robert warned, sadly, he passed last year at age 99, but Robert warned that nuclear war is so overwhelming, so uncontemplatable for human beings that human beings can only focus on the danger for a short period of time, perhaps 20 minutes, before they start to numb, before they start to freeze it out of their minds. And what happened with the end of the Cold War in 1991 was that the human species globally believed and wanted to believe that the nuclear threat had ended with the end of the Cold War. But the reality is that the nuclear threat has not only reemerged, but that we're closer to nuclear war now than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And we have avoided it in 1962 more by luck than by design, despite the fact that Kennedy and Khrushchev were both doing everything they could to avoid World War III. They both realized that they had lost control and that we had survived by luck. We can't let that happen again. And so I was in Japan this time. My student trips that you were talking about actually ended in 2020 because of COVID, when Japan stopped letting foreigners visit Japan because of the fear of COVID. So I've been back several times since, but not with students. However, this time I was invited back by the city of Nagasaki, by the Nagasaki Peace Movement, and by Asahi Shimbun, Japan's leading newspaper, to keynote an international peace conference in Nagasaki on July 25th. 6 American university students accompanied me on that visit. And so I spoke also in Kyoto. The students and I visit Kyoto, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. And I keynoted this major international peace conference in Nagasaki. So, and I focused there, as you say, on the nuclear threat, as I did in Consortium News with Rick Wolf and Ray McGovern and Joe Lauria, and as I will be when I go later this week to Italy for something called Tonale State, an alternative international university program that I've been addressing ever since my trips to Nagasaki and Hiroshima ended in 2020. So I've been to Tonale State several times. And this time, the opening session is going to begin with the opening comments by Elena Lanzoni, the head of the Tonale State. Then the first speaker is going to be the dean of the College of Cardinals. And then I'm going to give my international assessment of why the hands of the doomsday clock are ticking closer to midnight, to doomsday, and what we need to do about it. And among the things I'm going to be doing, as you know, is putting forth an appeal to Pope Leo, the American Pope, who's been an outspoken advocate for world peace and nuclear abolition. And we're appealing to Pope Leo to call for an international emergency summit meeting of minimally Donald Trump, the main threat to world peace right now, Vladimir Putin, who's still carrying out the war against Ukraine, and Xi Jinping. But other leaders can join that also, including Narendra Modi. I could even let the Europeans join us. Lula. We're also appealing to Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations, who's also been an outspoken advocate for climate change, for stopping global warming, as well as for world peace and stopping the nuclear threat. So right now, what we're calling on Pope Leo and Guterres for is because they have been the sole voices speaking for the planet, speaking for humanity. We've got other leaders, Trump wanting to make America great again. Xi wanting to make China great again. Modi wanting to make India great again. Putin wanting to make Russia great again. What we need is to get out of that mentality. We need to start thinking on a planetary basis and planetary scale. We need to start thinking as citizens of the world, not of Russia or Ukraine or China or Taiwan or any of the United States especially, so that we can begin searching for planetary solutions. Number one, end the current wars. Number two, end the nuclear threats. Number three, abolish nuclear weapons. Number four, end global warming. Number five, put legitimate guardrails against artificial intelligence, and absolutely keep artificial intelligence out of the command and control of nuclear weapons and out of warfare. We're in a desperate situation now. So it requires desperate actions. And we see that the United States, the strongest power in the world, cannot defeat Iran. We see that Russia, the second strongest military power in the world, has its hands more than full with Ukraine. And we need to say that warfare as a means of settling disputes is outmoded, obsolete, and no longer tolerable. If the United States and Israel cannot defeat Iran, if Russia cannot really defeat Ukraine after more than 5 years, we should learn a lesson. And in the U.S.-Israeli effort against Iran, this was a totally unprovoked assault against international law. Russia was heavily provoked into its attack on Ukraine, which still doesn't make it acceptable in the nuclear age. We have to learn the lesson in the nuclear age that warfare as a means of settling disputes cannot be tolerated. And right now, when we get to Iran, we see that Trump is desperate. The Iranians, if anything, have the upper hand and have been playing that hand with asymmetric warfare, with controlling the Strait of Hormuz, with attacking U.S. allies and assets throughout the Gulf region, with inflicting heavy damage. The Iranians have been preparing for this war for 20 years or longer, and now have the upper hand. So you've got a desperate Donald Trump, a man with a short fuse, a man who's reckless, impulsive, who's got his finger on the nuclear button in a desperate position, lying every time he opens his mouth, and knowing that he's backed up against the wall with his own party facing disaster in the upcoming midterm elections 3 months from now, at a time when the gas prices, the energy prices, food prices, other costs in the United States are skyrocketing. His approval rating is, according to Quinnipiac polling, at 32%. Imagine that. A modern president with the approval rating at 32%. The U.S. war against Iran is polling in the 20s. Barely a quarter of Americans support this. As you know, Americans, every time the U.S. has gone into a war since World War II, 60, 70, 80, 90% of Americans have supported it. This war, in its 5th month, has a support of barely a quarter of Americans. Trump is desperate, and a desperate Donald Trump, as even Hughes and I argued in Al Jazeera, is Donald Trump who could resort to nuclear weapons. So that's where we stand right now. I could go into much greater detail on all of this.
Peter, I want to comment on several things, and I'm going to go from the most recent back. You talk about Trump being desperate. He's really, I think you would agree, and most people would, that he's being controlled by Netanyahu and Israel. And if this thing really escalates, and if Iran, as it has promised, will destroy Israel, as a last resort, Israel, I believe for sure, will use a nuke. And what that will set off is, I don't have any idea. But you talked about it's a desperate situation that needs desperate action. I hope whoever watches this show will get that message. We are in desperate times. Peter, you mentioned Trump's got a war going against Russia, and I make no bones about it. I've been saying from the beginning that this is a war of the United States and the UK against Russia. They've stated it publicly. It's a core pillar of their foreign policy. Russia is nuclear armed. Thank God Putin has been so resilient and patient. At the same time, as you mentioned, we've got this extremely explosive and dangerous war of the United States and Israel against Iran. Nuclear weapons are involved, not just there, but Pakistan seems to be getting involved with India. They're a nuclear armed state. What will that do in their relationship with India, another nuclear armed state and not a friendly country? And then, Peter, at the same time, I think it's impossible to deny that the United States is deep into a Cold War with China, also a nuclear armed state. North Korea, also nuclear armed, is involved in all of this. So I just hope that people who are listening to this will share it, because your words of wisdom are so unemotional, so clear, but really immediate. And we do need desperate action. I really like what you said. We have to change our thinking in terms of making America great, Russia great, India great, Pakistan great, Israel great. You put the label on anybody. And we do have to start thinking in terms of a planetary solution, that we're citizens of this little tiny blue marble out there in this vast universe. Now I want to talk about the appeal to the American Pope Leo. who is anti-war, anti-nuclear. He's speaking out against it. He perhaps hasn't taken on Trump by name, but in all of his statements, everybody knows he's talking about Trump. He's not afraid. I think he realizes better than anybody else in the College of Cardinals, any previous pope, in recent years anyway, except Pope John the 23rd, who did realize how serious it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis when Kennedy and Khrushchev were trying to get together. He intervened. And so hopefully this effort, and I want you to describe for me a little more in detail the this appeal effort that I know was begun probably at least in part by my good friend Jack Gilroy, and you know who he is. You were an important person who signed on to a letter to an American archbishop to convey this appeal to the Pope. So, what can you tell me about this appeal or movement that Jack initiated? Who signed onto it, and really, what's the hope behind it?
Yes, you give credit correctly to Jack Gilroy. Jack has been an activist with Pax Christi, with Veterans for Peace, and this was initiated with the support of other leaders of Pax Christi. And what their idea was to appeal to Archbishop Wester in Chicago as the leading advocate for nuclear abolition in the U.S. church and the most outspoken anti-war figure in the U.S. Catholic Church, to appeal to him to urge Pope Leo to call this emergency international summit. So then Jack began circulating it, and people brought it to my attention. And we've been getting, so I jumped into it to help circulate it. We got a Japanese translation so I could circulate it to my friends in Japan, friends in Australia, around the planet. And it's been gaining momentum. And it's a letter to Archbishop Wester to encourage the Pope to take even greater action, in the sense that the situation grows more and more desperate by the day. We've got a desperate Donald Trump, who's now saying that he called off the biggest attack on Iran anywhere in the world since World War II. You know, and he's saying that because there's a peace deal in the works and the Iranians are desperate to negotiate. The Iranians say that there's no negotiations taking place and that they're not going to negotiate with the United States, and they're preparing for a U.S. hit. So you've got an increasingly deranged Donald Trump who's just out of touch. For example, what he's focused on are his vanity projects. He's focused on the reflecting pool. Okay, the U.S. judge appointed by the district attorney for the district, Jean Pirot, appointed by Donald Trump, a strong Trump supporter, issued a report saying that the damage to the reflecting pool was because of the contractors appointed by Trump and the Department of the Interior without the normal vetting process, and that Trump's claims that this is done with box cutters by vandals who deliberately sabotage the reflecting pool are totally bogus. Yet Trump doubled down on it. He doubled down on Todd Blanche. He doubles down on everything. The Kennedy Center, his famous ark that he wants to build. The man is completely out of his mind, completely deranged, borderline insane. Not only is he a pathological liar and pathological narcissist, he has got control of the nuclear button And there is nobody standing between him and the call for using nuclear weapons, whether it's against Russia, whether it's against China, whether it's against Iran, whether it's against North Korea. This is real. I'm not saying he's going to do it. But I know there are people around him who believe that he can and should do it. He's surrounded by warmongers, the Pete Hegseths, the Stephen Millers, the Sebastian Gorkas, increasingly the Marco Rubios. These are people who whisper in his ear. You mentioned Netanyahu. I don't know if Netanyahu is controlling him now, but Netanyahu certainly did influence him into going to war with Iran. Netanyahu had been trying to find the US president stupid enough, ignorant enough, reckless enough to go to war with Iran for more than 3 decades. He finally found his mark in Donald Trump. And so in the meetings in December and in February, he convinced Trump this is going to be a cakewalk. We've heard this over and over again. Every time we go into these wars, it's going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be a cakewalk for the United States against Afghanistan. It's going to be a cakewalk against Iraq. It's going to be a cakewalk against Libya. It's going to be a cakewalk for Brezhnev to go into Afghanistan in 1979. Every time, these are always going to be cakewalks. Ukraine was going to be a cakewalk. Forget it. This is never going to be cakewalks. You're going to have asymmetric warfare and resistance. And as the U.S. learned in Vietnam, the Vietnamese are much more committed to the war than the United States was. Can't go thousands of miles across the planet and think that you're going to have the same success or the same commitment as a country whose existence depends on defeating an invader. And we're seeing it now with Ukraine. We're seeing it with Iran. And we're going to see it in future wars if countries are stupid enough to initiate them again. And so we saw with Vietnam, we should learn that lesson. We haven't. In fact, the whole idea of the Vietnam syndrome, which the US leaders, the neocons, went against from the beginning, the idea that the United States should not get involved in future wars around the planet, that message was campaigned against deliberately by the neocons because they didn't want the Americans to get that message about how stupid and how unwinnable the Vietnam War was. Because the Americans think in terms of body counts. They think of how much we can blow up, how much we can destroy. And the United States killed, according to Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, when he came into my class, he said he accepted that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in that war. When I was back in Hanoi last year, the Vietnamese leaders told me that the number they use now is that 5 million Vietnamese died in that war. The United States lost 58,280 Americans in that war. That's nothing compared to what the Vietnamese lost. However, the United States could not win, not because it wasn't stronger, not because it didn't kill many times more people, but because the Vietnamese knew that they could not leave Vietnam. They were Vietnam. And the United States would eventually have to leave Vietnam. And so when Nixon took over, he pulled out the US troops and called for Vietnamization, for the Vietnamese to take over the fighting. Of course, that was not going to work. The Vietnamese were fighting an unpopular war in a country that, as much as they hated the war, we're not going to let go. We're not going to lose. The Iranians are in a comparable position now. And I try to draw that lesson. I talk about the Vietnam War a lot. And Oliver Stone, who was a decorated war hero in Vietnam, and I did this Untold History of the United States series of books and documentaries. And Oliver hates the war as much as I do. And I was an anti-war activist, and Oliver was a combat soldier in Vietnam. And we try to draw the lesson. You go, my students, the one place that they've almost all been to in Washington, the one monument they visited is the Vietnam Memorial Wall. And if you go there, you see these two walls, 492 feet long, with the names of 58,280 Americans who died. The message is that the tragedy of Vietnam is that 58,280 Americans died. That's not the message that I want to convey, or the message that Oliver and I conveyed in Untold History. If you had a memorial wall like the Okinawa Memorial Wall, with the names, Okinawa has the names of all the Okinawans, all the Japanese, all the Americans, all the Aussies, all the Thais, all the Brits, everybody who died there. Well, the Vietnam Memorial Wall had the names of 58,080 Americans, 5 million Vietnamese, 1 million Cambodians and Thais, Brits, Aussies, everybody else who died. That wall would be 10 miles long. That would be a fitting memorial to the Vietnam War, not this 492-foot long memorial. But that is not the mindset that the Americans have. And so we go into it over and over again. And now we're involved in another war. Trump campaign, no more forever wars, no more wars in the Middle East, no more sending US troops abroad. But we still haven't learned the lesson. This morning, I was listening to CNN or MSNBC or NPR or reading The Guardian or The Times or The Washington Post. And what they talk about is that there are 18 Americans dead and 600 wounded. I suffer for those Americans who are dead and wounded, but I suffer equally for the Iranians who died. And there have been thousands and thousands. And do they get mentioned in the US media coverage? Almost never. It's this egotistic America first approach, which has to be stopped. And it has to be stopped in the US media, which is corrupt and conveys Trump's messages as if they're taking him seriously. This idiot, this clown, this warmonger, this fascist. No. We need to change the media, and not just Fox News, which of course stinks, but also the mainstream, the establishment media, the corporate media that spreads the lies and conveys this mindset. So yeah, I'm sick of it all, but I'm worried because nobody has the sense of urgency, or few people do, that we need right now, that you and I share.
I want to comment again on a number of things that you've stated, and I couldn't agree with you more on your final few comments there, the last couple of minutes. But I want to go back to the nuclear threat. There are insane people in the United States, Hegseth is one of them, who think that the United States can win a nuclear war. But also here in Russia, Sergei Karaganov, a very well-known and influential person, has written an article, extensive article, putting forth the proposition that Russia could win a limited nuclear war and reestablish this nuclear deterrence, which he and others believe Russia has lost. That the United States is not afraid of Russia. They're not afraid of Putin. And I think this is extremely dangerous when this rhetoric gets played out in the media over there, across Europe, and here in Russia. And not to minimize the Europeans, geez, the Germans supposedly could develop a nuclear warhead maybe in a few months. France has said, we're going to cover you, Germany, with our nuclear umbrella. I mean, this rhetoric is out in the public, and that is what scares the bejesus out of me, Peter. I do think we are that close, and I think what I've just mentioned has got to be repeated and underscored along with all the rest of the messages. Now, I want to get back to the appeal to the Pope. Now, I've had Jack.
Can I just jump in and comment?
Yeah, of course, it's your show.
Oh, well, thanks. I defer to you. Medvedev has been saying that. Other Russians, when a close friend of mine met with Putin fairly recently, a couple months ago, Putin said he's under enormous pressure from the hawks in his own inner circle, who thinks that he should be acting much more aggressively in Ukraine. And we know that there are people in Russia who are advocating the use of nuclear weapons and who think that it could be successful. They're all over the planet now. You mentioned the Germans. The Japanese have a massive stockpile of plutonium. Takaichi is a far-right politician, kind of a protege of Abe's, and she's talking about doing away with Japan's 3 non-nuclear principles and, possibly Japan getting nuclear weapons. Japan was the most anti-nuclear country in the world after World War II. But not only Takaichi, but also Koizumi, the defense minister in Japan, said Japan needs a national debate and discussion about developing nuclear weapons, or at least housing U.S. nuclear weapons. I talk about the fact that every war effectively has been lost. The U.S. has lost pretty much every war it's been in since World War II. Maybe you can say Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada in 1983, the U.S. was able to defeat a couple dozen Cuban construction workers. But effectively every war, maybe not the first Gulf War, which could have been a partial victory, but but I even question World War II. Look who's leading the remilitarization of the Pacific. It's Japan. Who's leading the remilitarization of Europe? It's Germany. Did we really defeat Germany and Japan in World War II? If they're back now with a bigger platform and leading the militarization of the planet, or Trump in the United States, did we really defeat fascism when you've got Trump here? And what you're talking about, not only Germany, Japan, South Korea, we got Zelensky saying it's either giving us nuclear weapons or letting us join NATO. I mean, you say Macron extending the nuclear umbrella over Germany and other parts of Europe now. We see the president of Poland, now Rocky, saying that Poland needs its own nuclear weapons. This madness is spreading across our planet. The sanity, there's some voices of sanity in the global South and the SCO and the BRICS, and sometimes out of Ing and Lula, and the Pope and Guterres, but they're being drowned out by these warmongers who think that military solutions are the way to go. And the lesson that people are learning from Iran is that the mistake Iran had was to not have nuclear weapons. That's what North Korea keeps saying. The mistake Saddam Hussein made was that Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons, or else the U.S. couldn't have attacked. Well, maybe, and that's the lesson people are drawing. Not that we have to get rid of these effing nuclear weapons that threaten the future of life on our planet, but that we need more of them. And what we're seeing after all those years of cutting the size of the nuclear arsenals is we see them growing again. Britain is expanding its nuclear arsenal by 40%. Project 2025 that Trump goes by calls for dramatically increasing U.S. nuclear weapons. And Trump a few months ago said the U.S. has to begin nuclear testing again. How stupid can these people be? The U.S. is the one country that doesn't need nuclear testing. The U.S. tested over 1,000 times up until 1994. Or Russia stopped testing in 1992. China stopped testing in 1996. But the U.S. and Russia were the main ones who tested. And now the U.S. has a stockpile stewardship program where, without even conducting a real nuclear test, with these laboratory tests, the U.S. knows exactly what its stockpile is going to do. Who would benefit? China. China only tested 45 times before it stopped. India tested, I think, twice. Pakistan, once. North Korea, 6 times. These are the countries that would benefit from new nuclear testing, not the United States. But this Trump is such an idiot, he doesn't even understand these things. But what we're seeing, to follow through on what you were talking about, we saw on June 10th, night of 2025, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, issued a 2.5-minute video starting in Hiroshima. And she said what happened in Hiroshima is peanuts compared to the weapons that we have today. And she says we're closer to nuclear annihilation today than we've ever been. October 20th of last year, Sergei Naryshkin, the head of SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence agency, saying that civilization is at the most fragile point it's been at since World War II. We've got to go a different direction. The two heads of intelligence. And then on August 20th, 2024, I keep on bringing this up because it has to be remembered. There were 2 crucial articles came out that day. David Sanger on the front page of the New York Times had an article saying the U.S. is preparing to fight a simultaneous 3-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea. But that very same day, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist had a crucial report saying that there are 2 schools of nuclear strategists. One who believes in deterrence theory, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought because both sides will destroy each other. But a second school that's gaining traction in the United States and elsewhere, saying that a nuclear war can be fought and won. That now with sonar technology, with artificial intelligence, with other advanced technology, if the U.S. strikes preemptively, it can pinpoint the location of every Russian and Chinese sub and knock them out, and also ICBMs and fighter jets, and win a nuclear war. That school is gaining traction. It's around Netanyahu. It's around Trump in the Hegseths and the Millers and the Sebastian Gorkas and the others who are putting pressure. And so when you've got these kind of lunatics controlling the asylum, that's why our future as a species is more in threat now. I'm sorry, my friend Dan Ellsberg and your friend Dan Ellsberg is not here anymore to share us, because Dan was shouting that message up to his dying day. And even Hughes and I have been trying to get that out globally. And there have been others who have been sharing that, including my friends in Japan. But we're still, prophets crying out in the desert at a time when the world should understand how dangerous the situation is, how desperate we are. And you talked about Pope Leo again. I think Pope Leo understands it. And so I'm going to be meeting with the Dean of the College of Cardinals in less than a week. And I'm giving him this letter and just hoping that he will bring this to the Pope, because there are voices in the Vatican who understand this and share our concern and maybe have a platform to do something about it.
Peter, I want to go right back to this special appeal through Archbishop Wester, who I think must personally know Pope Leo. They're both from Chicago. Maybe they root for different baseball teams. I don't know. But Peter, I think this Pope is a modern Pope. He's an American. I think he must have been following American media, mainstream, and I would bet he's still following the alt media. I think this guy is so different than any Pope we've ever had. And so I have to ask you this question. What is the hope for outcome of this emergency meeting that people are hoping, bless you, my friend, that people are hoping Pope Leo will convene either in the Vatican or somewhere else. What do they think might happen? Do you think his voice might influence these people we're talking about? What do you think?
I think Pope Leo, first of all, knows that the trading deadline in Major League Baseball is 6 p.m. tonight in the Eastern time zone. I guess that makes it 5 p.m. in Chicago. So he's following the United States. And what I think is possible now is that the United States is looking for an off-ramp in Iran. I hope that Russia is looking for an off-ramp in Ukraine. I hope Xi and the Taiwanese are looking for off-ramps in the Strait of Taiwan. India and Pakistan looking for off-ramps in Kashmir. India and China looking for off-ramps in the Himalayas. Everybody looking for an off-ramp in the South China Sea. I think if Pope Leo makes the same kind of appeal that the Pope made in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis and gives Trump and Putin and Xi and Modi and others the space to save face, to say that they're submitting to this higher moral appeal in the name of humanity, to give up warfare, to end the wars, to end the conflicts, end the tension. You know, as Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy on October 30th, 1962, just a couple days after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, Khrushchev wrote so passionately and brilliantly that our people, from evil, some good must come. Our people have both felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. What we have to do now is clear. We have to eliminate every conflict between us that could lead to a new crisis. And the Pope had given them the room to do that, and Khrushchev thanked the Pope publicly for that. And Kennedy, the first Catholic president the United States had, you know, also appreciated the Pope's intervention. And so I think that we need the same thing now. As Modi likes to say, this is not a time of war. What he means by that is that this should not be a time of war. But these leaders know how dangerous the world is right now, and they don't have the strength on their own or the moral conviction to do what's necessary to end these wars and end these conflicts. I think the Pope can give them that kind of moral room to do what they need to do anyway. Trump is desperate in Iran. He doesn't know how to end it. Putin, you know, you're in Crimea. Regis, you know how bad the situation is becoming inside of Russia. And Putin is under enormous pressure. He doesn't want to start World War III. He knows what it would mean. He's not an idiot. You know, when Oliver Stone visited with him, when he interviewed him for 20 hours, Oliver asked Putin if he had ever watched the movie Dr. Strangelove. And Putin said he hadn't. And Oliver and Putin watched it together on Oliver's computer. I'm not sure if it was translated or not. But all these leaders should come to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was peanuts compared to what's going to happen now. All of them should watch The Day After. They should watch the British version of that, Threads. They should watch Testament. They should watch Strangelove. They should, you know, understand what they have the power to do to this planet. Because younger people who didn't live through World War II, which, you know, I certainly didn't live through the Cold War, don't have an understanding of how insanely dangerous and destructive nuclear weapons are. Khrushchev said, and we're lucky, He said when he was first briefed on nuclear weapons, he said he couldn't sleep for days. And that's the kind of mindset that we need. When Kennedy was briefed on preemptive strike plans for striking the Soviet Union, when Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed him, Kennedy walked out in the middle of the briefing and he turned to Secretary of State Dean Rusk and he said, "And we call ourselves the human race." We were lucky that they were in charge then. If Obama was the American president, and he's in some ways the best president the United States has had since Kennedy, he would never have stood up to his generals. He never did. He never had the backbone to do that. If he were there instead of Kennedy in '62, we wouldn't be here today. And he's the best of the American post-war presidents. And, you can say Jimmy Carter was a great ex-president, but he sure wasn't a great president when he was in power. And Biden gave the green light to Netanyahu to commit genocide in Gaza. Yeah. Biden was the one who gave the ATACMS and all the other advanced weapon systems to Zelensky to prolong the Ukraine war, to try to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. These are not responsible human beings or the kind of leaders the world needs.
I want to go back to the original question I asked you. What is the hope for outcome of this emergency meeting that Pope Leo might call? Now, I have a different take on that, Peter. As a former Roman Catholic priest, inactive, as somebody who was in college high school and college during the Vietnam War, you and I both remember the involvement of the Catholic Church, the involvement of Protestant churches, the involvement of Jewish synagogues in the anti-war movement. You talk about raising the consciousness of a moral dilemma. That's the job of the churches. And what makes me so disappointed, one of the major reasons, is that the churches have lost their voice. They have not mobilized people. They've not got them out into the streets, the priests, the nuns, the rabbis, the Protestant ministers, the seminarians. Millions of us were involved in this back during the Vietnam War, and it worked.
And you also look at the civil rights movement. You look at Selma. Now, who was at the forefront there? It was the religious leaders who rallied to that cause. We need that more. You're a former priest. I'm an avowed atheist, but I look to these people as moral spokespeople at a time when the leaders of the world have lost their moral compass. Maybe in private, some of them, have a different morality. And if we sat down with them, they would express that. But they, given the realities of power and what it takes, and the fact that they're all such old motherfuckers, right? My students in their generation, have a different vision. The burning moral issue for them is Gaza. I'm taking 15 students with me to Tonale Estate, to Italy later this week. They don't get credit for that. In fact, they pay for it. Most of them, the ones who don't need my scholarship money, are paying for this trip so they can come to meet with students and professors and religious leaders and journalists from around the world, because they're looking to build that kind of community. They're looking to build that kind of movement. I haven't seen this from students really since the 1980s, but I'm seeing a lot more of it now. We need the voice of the young. The young in the United States are the backbone of the democratic socialist movement, the Mamdanis and the others who are representing a different direction forward. We see with the old leaders, the Macrons, the Stormers, the Merzes, and others, they want to take money out of housing, out of healthcare, out of education, out of food programs, and invest in their militaries. That's their idea, to remilitarize the planet. You know, there's no discussion, certainly in the United States, of global warming. Trump says it's a hoax. The U.S. is investing in fossil fuels, coal even. You know, these people have no interest in the future. But I think that that's, you know, we don't, you and I don't know how much longer we have on this planet, but we care about the future. You know, that's, you know, Dan Ellsberg's message. The last months of his life, when he knew that age 94 was coming to an end, you know, was the future, you know, and ending nuclear, abolishing nuclear weapons, and hopefully rebuilding the planet on the basis of uplifting the populations, the global south, the African Union, the BRICS, the SCOs, and also those populations in the United States and Europe and Asia.
Peter, I'm going to come back to Pope Leo, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, and every time I can. I think he is the only person on the planet who can appeal to the moral conscience of all faiths, of atheists, doesn't matter. I think he's the only one, but he has to be bold, in my opinion. He's got to state clearly the challenge to all of humanity. There's no other person in my mind, and I haven't been a big fan of the papacy, especially since Pope John the 23rd. I was studying in Rome right after Vatican II, and what has happened since has been an extreme disappointment, and it's part of what really made me feel that the church, I didn't leave the church left me, because they abandoned everything, absolutely everything that was articulated in that Second Vatican Council, which was so exciting. And so I hope that this Pope will be strong, will be articulate, will keep repeating it over and over again. And maybe he can inspire these leaders that we're talking about. Maybe he can make people speak up and say, yes, he's right, and oppose these leaders in Germany, in the United States, in Russia, wherever they are, who are contemplating the possibility of nuclear war, which is going to be the end of what we've been talking about, humanity on this planet. You mentioned several other things, and I think this Pope can address them. He can address climate change. He can address AI. He's certainly aware of this. He's a young man compared to many of those who took over the papacy in my lifetime, which is 81 years. So anyway, Peter, that's my hope. And, you know, I really hope it. I know you're going to make these points when you're in Italy. You will be, you'll be very popular. I'm absolutely convinced of it. As an American speaking this language, not just to the Italian people and the Vatican, but the entire world. I wish you a safe trip. I wish you all kinds of luck in your efforts to get this appeal to Pope Leo. I really believe he's humanity's last chance, and I hope that he steps up to the challenge. Peter, thanks for hanging in there with me. It was a little touch and go on whether we were going to be able to get this show done in the first place.
Well, thank you, Regis. It's always uplifting for me to be on with you. And I appreciate your encouragement in this effort, and everything you can do to help get the word out. I'm going to be as strong as I can with the Dean of the College of Cardinals, because he has access to the Pope that few people have.
I don't do a lot of praying to anything above, but I do believe in energy. I believe in, um, I just believe that these messages can be communicated to people through other people. Thousands, millions, billions of people need to step up. Peter, thanks so much.
Thank you, Regis.